I don't know if you had similar experiences as me or has felt this way before as well, but for me, one of the biggest sources of suffering has actually been spirituality and mindfulness and all the teachings around it, which is super ironic because it's supposed to be something that leads us to less suffering and more peace. But in my personal experience, it has been quite the opposite. But by no means am I stating that spirituality and mindfulness leads to suffering. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that my understanding of it, for example, my definition of presence, my perception of presence up until recently is what has led me to my personal experience of suffering around this. And this is what I'm going to be talking about in this video. And I will also be talking about how that understanding has shifted recently and has actually led to a deeper experience of peace within myself. But before we get there, I want to share just briefly a bit about my experience with spirituality. So I came across spirituality and mindfulness around 15 years ago when I was back in college, and at the time of struggling with intrusive thoughts. And these thoughts took the form of kind of like commands in my mind, dictating my behavior, like dictating, telling me how to act, telling me what to say, how to say it in front of people. And they would interfere and they would become activated and interfere with my interaction with friends, with family, just like whenever I was around people in social situations. And it was so strange and so scary at the same time because when they interfered, I just felt like a robot kind of moving through life and performing without a soul and just purely completely on command. It's like I felt like this puppet being pulled by these like strings. Um and so I decided to see a counselor about this, and she had suggested the book Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, such a classic on spirituality. And it was from this book that I came across the concept of presence and how it's achieved through our realization that we're actually the observer, that we're actually the sky in the background that's observing our thoughts and emotions passing by like clouds. And I think it was because of the usage of the term observer, observation, that I took it to mean that in order to be present, we cannot engage with our thoughts or emotions. Because when we say observe, what immediately comes to my mind is that there's the observer and there's the object being observed. And what that naturally implies is this distance between the two. So I kind of I I kind of interpreted that to mean that yeah, like presence is achieved by creating this distance between our awareness and our thoughts, emotions, in order for us to kind of become the observer, and in order for the act of observation to occur. Um, and this was the very start of my suffering for the next 15 years, like this understanding of what presence means. Because when I think that it's about not engaging with our thoughts or emotions, whenever I noticed my thoughts or emotions surfacing within me, I would consciously push them away. And because when they surface, they're like in our body, they're in our mind, they're in like our entire being. In order to create that distance between my awareness and these thoughts and emotions, I would actually kind of extract my awareness out of my body so that I'm kind of perceiving myself acting and behaving from this higher perspective. And that created a lot of discomfort and suffering because I was in this kind of like disembodied state. Again, like watching myself behave and act and say things without a soul. And it's actually so similar to my experience with the intrusive thoughts. And it just felt so ungrounding. And also, a lot of the times, especially in moments where I'm surrounded by beautiful scenery, or when I'm in a place that I usually don't get access to, in these moments, I would put the pressure on myself to be present. Because to kind of like soak up that moment, like to really enjoy, immerse myself in a place that I usually don't get to experience. And because my understanding of presence was that I cannot engage with my thoughts or emotions, or my definition of presence was this like state of awareness where there's total alert or like total focus, but void of any thoughts or emotions. When that pressure to be present arises in those moments, I would tell myself, like, don't feel, don't think, and just be present. And now speaking about this, honestly, like, this is no different from the intrusive thoughts that kind of started this whole journey for me. Now I see the similarity. Now I see the resemblance. Yes. But yeah, so these commands will come into the mind, pressuring me to be present. But when these commands come in, obviously my focus is entirely on these thoughts in the mind. So I would actually become less present when these commands happen. But the less present I am, the more pressure my mind would put on myself, and the more forceful these commanding thoughts will become. And then the more tightly I would grip onto the mind, and then the less present I would become even more. Um, or the more like desperate I would want to pull away from the mind and be present. So it was kind of like a downward spiral, this like um, downward spiral of internal conflict, like internal tension. It felt like I was being tied to two horses, um, like being pulled in opposite direction. And this was extremely uncomfortable, created a lot of suffering, because it just felt like my awareness was being trying to be what I was trying to split my awareness into two different places that was just impossible. And the the conflict and the tension actually manifested in like physically in the form of headaches and anxiety, and I would just feel like completely exhausted from fighting this fight in myself, with my own mind. um, but if I were to look back onto my experience of suffering around spirituality, like these experiences I had for the past 15 years, it's so long. I think it kind of all comes down to the fact that I saw presence as this state of consciousness to be attained. Like I kind of turned it into another object of desire, another object of craving, another form of attachment. And we all know through Buddhist teachings that craving, desire, attachment is what ultimately leads to suffering. Because when we put something on a pedestal, when we label something as good, as correct, as better, the controlling mind immediately activates itself and pushes us towards that thing, while rejecting everything else that doesn't align with it, that isn't it. So in a given moment, um, if any component or aspect of that moment misaligns with this thing that we're focused on achieving, we reject that moment. We resist those components of that moment, and therefore we resist the moment itself. And that's what kind of prevents us from dropping into the now. Um, and and that's what kind of creates this struggle, this internal conflict, um, in ourselves as well. And for me, this resistance of the present moment was amplified, um, on top of the fact that I put presence as this like object of desire on the pedestal. It was amplified because my definition of presence was a state of consciousness that um, that's void of any emotion and thoughts. And that's just ridiculous because emotions and thoughts are a part of and are an inevitable part of our human experience. Like we cannot escape that and we cannot control it. They just kind of like naturally arise within ourselves. As long as we have a mind, as long as we have a nervous system, that's going to be our experience. That's going to be a part of our experience. So to to be striving towards this state of consciousness without thoughts or emotions, I was rejecting my reality completely. And there was total resistance of my reality, and there was total struggle. And I thought I was the only one kind of experiencing this, but the more people I talk to about this, the more I share this with others, the more I realize that it's a very common experience. It's a very common thing for people kind of to, I guess, unintentionally do. Like a lot of people actually had, I think, similar experiences of turning spirituality into another form of attachment and therefore experiencing suffering instead of peace because of the spiritual teachings that we are exposed to, especially the new age spiritual teachings. I'm not saying that they did this or are doing this intentionally, but the way they frame presence, the way they frame um, like the state of conscious awareness or spiritual awakening, especially, it's like they kind of describe it as this like ultimate goal in life, describe it as like this like one thing we need to achieve as a soul in a given reincarnation. And this glorification of awakening and sprites and presence and whatnot makes it so easy for us, for the audience, for the students to automatically label it as good and as something to be achieved, and turn it into another concept within the trap of duality and turn it into another kind of tool of control for the mind. And it wasn't until like very recently for me personally, after having moved through a huge amount of fear, where I was kind of left with no option other than really facing my fears and really surrendering to all the experiences that came with it, that I came to realize that, presence is not at all about pushing away our thoughts or emotions. And it's certainly not a state of consciousness that we can manufacture, that we can control. It's actually something that emerges naturally through radical acceptance, accepting all the experiences that we're having in a given moment, even if that experience isn't in alignment with presence. Because when we accept all that is, when we lean in, when we embrace, we're allowing ourselves to really drop in to every aspect and component of the present moment. And there's no struggle, there's no resistance against any part of it. And also, when we practice this acceptance, we're actually meeting ourselves exactly where we are in the now, no matter the state of consciousness we're in, no matter the emotional state, no matter the mental state, no matter the physical state. Again, every single component of that single moment in time. And these emotional, mental, physical experiences are experiences of the egoic self, are the experiences that the egoic self is having. So when we meet these experiences, what we're meeting these experiences with is actually the observer part of ourselves, the background, the backdrop of the egoic self, the conscious awareness that all of these spiritual teachings talk about and glorify. So every moment, every time we're able to meet ourselves where we are, we're actually bringing forth this deeper aspect of ourselves where presence, where peace resides. And we're deepening our connection to this part. And this is how presence naturally emerges and strengthens through acceptance. And perhaps this is what the spiritual teachings really meant when they, say observe or observation, that they really mean acceptance or leaning in. But having gone through this experience myself, like having experienced presence and peace through acceptance, through the act of acceptance, I would actually not use the word observe to describe this process or this practice. It doesn't seem like it's accurate, because when we say observe, it inevitably shifts or directs our attention to the mind, because it is through the mind we observe things. But when we're accepting, when we're leaning in, it's coming from the soul. It's energetic. It's not logical. Like, it's much more embodied than the radical mind. So the terms I would use instead to describe this process of cultivating the conditions for presence would be, feel, sense, or just flowing with. And honestly, though, doesn't matter how I describe it, because true acceptance or the act of acceptance is something that we all know. We all experience on a daily basis. It's just that we don't quite notice it. We haven't intentionally kind of like defined it for ourselves. And especially in the moments that are more difficult, where we might be experiencing more discomfort, our instinct is not to accept. Our instinct is to escape from that moment. So I think it might be helpful for us to kind of truly define what true acceptance is, or truly recognize what it feels like, for us to intentionally practice acceptance, especially in the more difficult moments. So if I were to give you an example of what acceptance or leaning in feels like, I would invite you to imagine yourself walking down the street in the morning, and you're walking past by this bakery shop preparing for the day, and suddenly become engulfed in this smell of freshly baked goods, and it smells so wonderful that as you walk by, you just want to immerse your whole being in that smell. You want to soak everything up just to really enjoy it. And that intention, that willingness, that embracing, that energetic embracing is the act of acceptance. That's what it truly feels like. So I would love to gently invite you to just experiment with this, especially when there might be uncomfortable feelings or sensations. It might be difficult at first, because again, we're conditioned to see anything uncomfortable or to perceive anything uncomfortable as threats, and we're conditioned to run away from it from the get-go. But perhaps just gently allow yourself to, lean into it for a moment longer, to embrace it for a moment longer, and just feel and sense the change in your body. Feel and sense what might shift because of that experience. And I would love to hear about, what awaits for you on the other side of that experience, what you might arrive at. Please let me know if, you feel called to. And with that, I really hope that I was clear in this video in explaining my experience, and also especially in explaining my learnings and my realizations. It's all very like meta. I don't know if that's the right word to describe it. So it's really hard to explain with words. So I really hope that was clear. And thank you so much for sitting through this video with me again. And if you have any questions, and if any part of the video or my explanation wasn't clear, please drop your questions in the comment section, and I would be sure to answer them the best way I can. So, well, that's it for now, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye.